There is a kind of hatred that doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't insult. It doesn't declare itself. It's a hatred that lives alongside you, that sits at your table, that smiles at you on birthdays and at gatherings, but inside feels pleased when you stumble. Maybe you've felt it already. Something doesn't quite fit, but you justify it. You tell yourself you're overreacting, that it's all in your head, that it's better not to think badly of someone close to you. But what if it isn't imagination? What if your intuition has been warning you for a long time and you keep silencing it? With the years, you learn that the deepest harm doesn't always come from a clear enemy, but from someone who knows your cracks, your silences, your efforts. Someone who doesn't attack you head-on, but little by little chips away at your firmness, your presence, your joy. How do you recognize that silent hatred without becoming paranoid? How do you set a boundary without hardening your heart or losing dignity? And what do you do when you discover that you can't change the other person, but you can change the way you stand in the world? My name is Gabriel, and this is the Stoic Garden. Next, I'm going to show you 10 signs, 10 subtle movements that the philosophy of the ancient Stoics helped me see clearly when I was no longer young and could no longer afford to keep living confused. Not so you can point fingers at anyone, but so you can recover inner sovereignty, calm, and respect for yourself. Stay with me. This isn't about them. It's about how you stay upright when affection becomes uncertain ground. 1. Contempt disguised as cordiality. There is a kind of contempt you don't notice at first because it comes wrapped in politeness. It doesn't raise its voice or cross an obvious line. It disguises itself as a light joke, a well-intentioned comment, an unnecessary correction delivered with a smile. You feel it, but you can't quite explain it. Something shrinks inside you every time it happens. And still you carry on because you don't want to seem oversensitive, because at this age, you tell yourself you're done with small conflicts. Have you ever felt uncomfortable without being able to say exactly why? I've been there. At family gatherings, in conversations where no one yelled and no one argued, yet I left more tired than when I arrived. I remember sitting there, my back a little stiffer than usual, listening to someone close to me speak in that friendly tone that somehow always found a way to diminish something I said or did. It wasn't a frontal attack. It was worse. It was slow erosion. And for a long time, I convinced myself the problem was mine, that I was misinterpreting things, that I shouldn't make a big deal out of it. Thinking out loud helped me see something uncomfortable. When you need to justify someone's behavior over and over again, when you repeat, they don't mean it badly, like a mantra, maybe you're not being generous, maybe you're being evasive. Disguised contempt works because it appeals to your desire for harmony. You want peace, you want to preserve the bond, and so you give up internal ground. Stoicism taught me something simple and hard at the same time. Clarity comes before calm. If you don't name what's happening, even if only to yourself, there can be no real peace. This isn't about accusing or confronting right away. It's about a first act of sovereignty that no one sees, naming internally what it is, not exaggerating it, but not denying it either. Saying to yourself soberly, this feeling isn't respect, and when you do that, something shifts. You don't react the same way. You don't explain yourself as much. You don't shrink. Can you feel the difference between enduring out of maturity and enduring out of fear of losing the bond? I remember an old friend, already retired, who always came back from visiting his brother with a headache. There was never an argument, but he always returned smaller. One day he told me something I've never forgotten. He doesn't insult me, but he doesn't look at me as an equal either. That sentence was a door. From then on, he stopped justifying it. He didn't break the relationship. He simply stopped exposing himself in the same way. He adjusted his presence, his time, his energy. That too is a practical tool, reducing intimacy where there is no respect without drama. Epictetus said that it's not things that disturb us, but the judgments we make about them. Here the key judgment is to stop calling cordiality what takes away your dignity. When you see clearly, you regain control, not to dominate the other, but to govern yourself. The phrase that held me was simple, almost uncomfortable to accept. Not everyone who smiles wishes you well. It's not a bitter sentence, it's an adult observation. This first recognition doesn't bring immediate relief. It brings a new tension, because once you see, you can't unsee, and that discomfort will stay with you for a while. It's the price of stopping lying to yourself. But it's also the beginning of something firmer, because if you don't name contempt while it's still subtle, later you'll have to carry something much heavier, and there's still a lot more to look at. 2. The constant need to diminish you to feel superior. There are people who don't know how to be with you unless they're slightly above you. They don't say it outright, of course. They do it by correcting you when it's unnecessary, pointing out minor mistakes, reminding you of past achievements as if they were current, or subtly but persistently comparing your path to that of others. You speak, and somehow there's always the feeling that you're lacking something. That's no accident. It's a twisted form of balance. For them to feel like someone, you need to be less. Have you noticed how some conversations turn into a scale where you always end up weighing less? Thinking about this hurts because it often comes from someone close, someone who has known you for years. In my case, it took me a long time to see it because I confused familiarity with entitlement. I believed that because of shared history, certain attitudes were normal. They weren't. They were small maneuvers of superiority. And the most dangerous part wasn't what that person was doing, but what I was starting to do inside, justifying myself, over-explaining, defending decisions that didn't need defending. That's when I knew something had shifted. There's a very common scene in later life. You're telling a story, something simple, and someone interrupts to show they know more, did it earlier, did it better. They don't shout. They step on you. And if you're not careful, you enter the game. You start competing without having chosen to. Stoicism helped me see that this competition isn't an external challenge, it's an internal trap. You don't have to prove your worth to someone who needs to diminish you to sustain theirs. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that a man's worth doesn't depend on another's opinion, but on the uprightness of his actions. He didn't say it to feel superior, but to avoid getting lost. There's a practical tool here that sounds simple, but is hard. Stop responding to the implicit provocation. Don't correct the one who corrects. Don't over-explain. Don't enter the comparison. Sober silence, when it comes from clarity and not fear, disarms more than any argument. I saw this clearly in an old co-worker, long retired, who still competed with everyone as if he was still in the office. Every conversation was a ranking. One day he chose something different. He didn't confront anyone. He didn't leave. He simply stopped playing. When someone tried to diminish him, he nodded and went on with his life. At first it was uncomfortable. Then it was liberating. He told me something that still resonates. I didn't elevate myself, but I stopped shrinking. That's a sentence worth keeping. The hammer phrase here isn't kind, but it's honest. Someone who needs to diminish you isn't strong. They're desperate. Understanding this isn't to look at them with contempt, but to stop offering them your emotional energy as fuel. If there's no resistance, there's no fight. And without a fight, their game loses its meaning. This point leaves an open question that's worth sitting with. How many times have you entered comparisons you never chose, just to avoid looking bad, to avoid seeming weak, to avoid discomfort? Because as long as you keep running in races that aren't yours, someone else will be setting the finish line for you. And we still haven't reached the most silent part of all this. 3. Silent satisfaction at your stumble. There's something especially unsettling when you realize that someone close to you doesn't rejoice in your falls, but doesn't grieve them either. They simply settle internally. You share a difficulty, a loss, a mistake, and on the other side, there's no real support or genuine concern. There's a strange calm, sometimes even excessive attention, as if they were taking notes. They don't celebrate, but they don't accompany you either, and you leave that conversation feeling more exposed than held. Have you ever felt that your stumble calms someone else? This is hard to accept because it goes against a deeply rooted idea that those around us naturally want our good. Over the years, I understood that this isn't always true. There are people whose identity is sustained by comparison, and when you fall, their inner world rearranges itself. Not because they hate you as an individual, but because what you represent becomes unbearable when you're standing firm. Recognizing this doesn't make you cynical. It makes you lucid. I remember a specific moment in my life, already well into my later years, when I went through a financial difficulty. It wasn't dramatic, but it was humbling to my pride. When I shared it, I noticed something strange in someone very close to me. They didn't offer help or even clumsy words of comfort. They listened with serene attention, almost relieved. It took me time to understand it. My fall restored their balance. For years, I had been a reference point. Now I wasn't. That day, I understood that not all silence is respect. Here, there's an important reframing that Stoicism gave me. Seneca warned that envy is saddened by another's happiness and pleased by their ruin. He didn't say this to point at the envious, but to protect the observer. When you understand that it's not against you as a person, but against what you embody, resentment loses strength. You stop taking it personally and start seeing it as someone else's symptom. In later life, this becomes more visible. When your body no longer responds the same way, when you need help, when you acknowledge limits, some people feel calmer. You no longer confront them with their own shortcomings. The practical tool here is sober. Measure carefully what you share and with whom. Not everyone deserves access to your falls. Intimacy is also managed, not out of distrust, but out of emotional hygiene. This isn't comfortable, but it's real. Someone who feels relieved by your stumble is already living in a fall, even if they don't know it. Understanding this doesn't make you superior, it makes you responsible. Responsible for not becoming an enemy to someone who is already corroded inside. You don't need to return the damage or point it out. It's enough not to expose yourself. This point leaves a discomfort worth holding for a while. If someone settles when you fall apart, what place are they really giving you in their life? Because when you start getting back up again, that calm may turn into something else. And we still haven't talked about what happens when support simply disappears. 4. Strategic withdrawal of support. There's a moment when nothing visible happens and yet something is missing. They no longer call, they no longer ask, they're no longer there when they used to be. There's no argument, no rupture, no harsh words, just a clean withdrawal, almost elegant. You're still there, but the support is gone. And the most confusing part is that if you point it out, there's always a reasonable explanation. Work, fatigue, other priorities. Everything sounds logical, everything except what you feel. How many times have you noticed absences you don't know how to name? This usually hurts more in later life, when the circle shrinks and each bond weighs more. I remember a period when I went through a mild illness, nothing serious but enough to need company. I didn't ask for much, just presence. And that's when I noticed who withdrew without noise, not out of inability, but out of choice. No one attacked me. They simply stopped being there. It took me time to accept it because I preferred to think it was circumstantial. It wasn't. Thinking it through led me to an uncomfortable conclusion. Close hatred doesn't always express itself with hurtful words. Sometimes it expresses itself by withdrawing support when you need it most. It's a form of silent punishment. They don't say, "I don't care about you," but they act as if your burden were inconvenient. And the danger here isn't their behavior, it's your reaction. If you start demanding presence, asking for explanations, begging for attention, you lose something more valuable than support. You lose your center. Stoicism is clear on this. Don't expect virtue where there is none. Epictetus insisted on adjusting expectations to the reality of people, not to the image you wish they were. The practical tool here is hard, but freeing. Recalibrate. See who is there when you're not shining, when you're not contributing, when you're not holding things together. And from there, reorganize your giving. Don't cut abruptly. Don't take revenge. Simply don't expect what no longer arrives. I've seen many older men get trapped in nostalgia for lost support. They keep acting as if nothing has changed, offering loyalty where there's no longer reciprocity. That drains you. Once, talking to a widowed neighbor like me, he told me something simple. I stopped calling first. It wasn't a strategy, it was a test. The silence that followed hurt him, but it also ordered his life. He knew who he could truly count on. The Stoic doesn't demand loyalty where there is no virtue. Accepting that doesn't make you cold, it makes you precise. Precise with your time, your energy, your affection. In later life, that's dignified survival. Because when you adjust expectations and reduce your giving, something shifts in the other person. Sometimes reproach appears. Sometimes competition. Because when you no longer hold someone up with your presence, some try to reclaim you in other ways. And that's where another dynamic begins, one that's worth watching closely. 5. Unnecessary competition and constant comparison. There are relationships where everything turns into a race, even though no one ever gave the starting signal. You share something, and without knowing how, it becomes a comparison. Your achievements are measured, your decisions evaluated, your limits questioned. The topic doesn't matter. Health, money, children, routine. There's always an implicit benchmark, a need to show who's ahead. And the strangest thing is that you never wanted to run. Have you ever wondered when you agreed to compete without choosing to? In later life, this dynamic becomes more visible because there's less room to fake energy. The body signals it, the pace slows. And still, there are those who keep pushing comparison as if life were a leaderboard. I remember gatherings where someone turned every conversation into a scorecard. Who walks more? Who has more activities? Who's doing better? At first you respond out of politeness, then out of habit. Until one day you notice the fatigue that doesn't come from the body, but from the soul. Thinking it through led me to something uncomfortable to accept. Unnecessary competition doesn't speak about you, it speaks about the other person's emptiness. When someone needs to measure themselves constantly, it's because they don't know how to be with themselves. The problem arises when you lend yourself to that measurement. When you start adjusting your value to rules you didn't choose. That's when you lose sovereignty. Not because you come out below, but because you accept the game. The Stoics were clear on this. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that he shouldn't live as if he were in dispute with anyone, but as someone who fulfills his role with uprightness. Applied to everyday life, the practical tool is simple and demanding. Step out of the circuit. Don't respond to the comparison, don't correct the data, don't prove anything. When someone turns everything into competition, you can choose stillness. It's not passivity, it's a conscious refusal to run. I saw this in an older man in the neighborhood, a former athlete who kept competing even after several surgeries. Everything was a test. One day he decided to walk alone, at his own pace, without counting steps or records. When people asked, he answered calmly, "I walk because I walk." At first they mocked him. Then they stopped measuring him. He didn't win anything visible. He gained something rarer, peace. It's not about winning, it's about not running. When you understand that, many tensions dissolve on their own, not because the other changes, but because you no longer sustain the dynamic. 6. using silence, exclusion, and omission. There are attacks that make no noise. They don't come with harsh words or visible gestures. They come as prolonged silences, invitations that never arrive, conversations that happen without you. No one throws you out. They simply stop counting you in. And the most disconcerting thing is that if you ask, there's always a reasonable excuse, a forgetfulness, a misunderstanding. I thought you wouldn't be interested. How many times have you felt erased slowly without being able to point to a clear culprit? At this stage of life, exclusion weighs differently. You no longer have the same energy to rebuild circles easily. That's why it hurts more. I remember long afternoons after becoming a widower when I found out about family or friends' gatherings after they had already happened. No one told me with bad intentions, they said. But the omission repeated itself. And when something repeats, it stops being an accident. Thinking that was hard, but necessary. Silence used as a weapon seeks something very specific, to make you doubt your place, to make you start wondering what you did wrong, what you should change, how to fit back in. And that's the trap. If you start begging for belonging, you give up your dignity without anyone explicitly asking for it. Stoicism helped me see that a man's worth doesn't depend on being included, but on remaining whole even when left on the margins. There's a very common scene you might recognize. You sit at a table where the conversation flows, but it doesn't pass through you. They talk, they laugh, they decide. You're present, but not counted. That moment tests your character. You can force your way in, make noise, seek attention, or you can observe, breathe, and decide something internally. The practical tool here is sober and demanding. Stop begging for a place. If they don't include you, don't humiliate yourself. Adjust your presence. Sometimes withdrawing with dignity is a form of affirmation. Epictetus warned that no one can humiliate you without your consent. Exclusion hurts, yes, but it doesn't define you. It defines the group that needs to erase someone to feel united. Understanding this shifts the axis. You stop asking why you're not there and start asking whether that's a place worth being. And that question, when answered honestly, reorganizes many decisions. Someone who knows who they are doesn't beg for belonging. That's not coldness, it's inner governance. It's accepting that solitude, when it's not chosen out of fear, but assumed with firmness, can be more dignified than a table where you become invisible. 7. Envy as the hidden engine of hatred. Envy rarely shows itself as open rage. It's more discreet, more polite. Sometimes it even looks like admiration. But if you look closely, you'll see that it doesn't want what you have. It wants you not to have it. It wants you to lower the volume, reduce your presence, not stand out, not be so at peace. Have you ever noticed discomfort in someone close just when you're serene, when you lack nothing essential? Thinking this is hard because envy is associated with immature people, and at a certain age you expect something else. But age doesn't vaccinate against inner emptiness. I've seen older men, with everything apparently resolved, tense up when someone else finds balance in solitude, when they don't need approval, when they don't compete. That unsettles them because it exposes a lack that can't be disguised with past achievements. I remember a calm, almost banal conversation where I mentioned that I was fine living alone, that I had learned to be with myself without noise. The response was a rigid smile and an ironic comment. Nothing serious. But the atmosphere changed. That's when I understood something important. My calm was a threat. Not because I did anything, but because it showed a possibility the other person didn't want to face. That's envy in its mature form. It doesn't shout. It grows uncomfortable. Stoicism helps you not intoxicate yourself with this. Seneca warned that envy is a punishment the envious person inflicts on themselves. Understanding this protects you from two common mistakes. The first, returning the poison. The second, minimizing yourself so as not to provoke discomfort in others. Neither is dignified. The practical tool here is observation without judgment. See envy as a symptom, not a personal attack. That allows you to stay firm without hardening. In later life, this becomes especially delicate. When there's not much future ahead, some people need the other person not to be well either. To complain together, resent together, remember better times together. And if you choose something else, if you choose sobriety and order, you break the implicit pact. Not everyone tolerates that, and you don't have to make it easier for them. Listen carefully, because understanding this frees you. The envious person suffers more than you do, even if it doesn't look like it. Seeing it this way doesn't make you superior. It makes you responsible for not imitating their inner movement. You don't need the other to fall in order to stand. Because when you don't return the poison and don't minimize yourself, something new happens. The other person loses control, and when someone loses control, they tend to react, sometimes with coldness, sometimes with provocation. And that's where one of the most misunderstood tools of all appears: conscious indifference. 8. Conscious indifference as a boundary. There comes a moment when something flips. You've already seen, adjusted expectations, stepped out of comparisons, stopped begging for a place. And then something curious happens. The other person's discomfort increases. Not because you attack them, not because you confront them, but because you no longer react as you used to. Conscious indifference has that effect. It's not a lack of sensitivity, it's the presence of inner governance. Have you noticed how certain people are more unsettled by your calm than by any reproach? Thinking this through took me time, because I confused indifference with coldness. I believed that to be upright, I had to harden myself. That's not it. Stoic indifference isn't contempt. It's a boundary. It's deciding what deserves your energy and what doesn't. I remember a period when I stopped responding to certain veiled comments, to soft provocations. I didn't explain anything. I didn't announce anything. I simply stopped entering. The silence wasn't empty. It was chosen. In later life, this tool becomes vital. The body no longer tolerates constant emotional wear. Pride shouldn't either. There are people who feed on your reaction, even on your discomfort. When they no longer get it, they feel displaced. Not because you've excluded them, but because they've lost influence. That's when hatred, previously subtle, can intensify. Not because you do harm, but because they no longer control you. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that he should live according to his rational nature, not react like a wounded animal. Applied to everyday life, the practical tool is clear. Respond only to what is just to respond to. Not to everything. Not always. Not immediately. Sometimes the firmest response is offering none at all. That requires inner strength, not emotional emptiness. I remember an older woman, a family friend, who stopped justifying herself to a constantly critical daughter. She didn't confront her. She didn't cut her off completely. She simply stopped explaining every decision. At first, the tension increased. Then something settled. The daughter lost ground. Not because the mother gained power, but because she stopped giving it away. That's the difference. The hammer phrase here isn't comfortable, but it's necessary. When you don't react, you reveal who depended on your reaction. And that hurts the other person more than any argument. Not because you wound them, but because they can no longer manage you. 9. Staying upright without hardening. After all this, the most silent risk of all appears. It doesn't come from outside, it comes from you. When you've been exposed to contempt, competition, exclusion, and envy, something inside starts to tense up. You become more vigilant, drier, more closed, not out of malice, but out of fatigue. And here an uncomfortable question arises that's worth facing. Are you protecting yourself, or are you deforming yourself? Thinking this through led me to review my own gestures, not those of others. I began to notice that I responded less, yes, but I also listened less. That certain attitudes no longer affected me, but neither did some good presences move me anymore. That's when I understood that firmness without temperance turns into hardness. And hardness, over the years, isolates more than any external enemy. In later life, there's an understandable temptation to become stone so you don't feel. The body already hurts, losses weigh heavily, and you think closing off is the most efficient way to go on. But Stoicism never proposed that. It proposed stability, not insensitivity. Epictetus spoke of maintaining character without losing humanity. It's not easy. It requires constant attention. I remember an older man, very respected, who after several family betrayals decided not to expect anything from anyone. It worked for a while. He was safe. But he was also alone in a different way. Not because of the absence of others, but because of the absence of openness. One day he told me something that stuck with me. No one hurts me, but no one brings me joy either. That's when I understood the hidden cost of hardening. The practical tool here is subtle but concrete. Differentiate between boundaries and walls. A boundary protects without denying possible connection. A wall protects by denying everything. Ask yourself honestly, does this keep me whole or does it make me inaccessible? Not to others, but to yourself. Because if you lose the capacity to feel with sobriety, the other person's hatred will already have won something important. 10. The 4 Stoic virtues as real armor. After walking this whole path, something becomes clear. Seeing the signs isn't enough. Setting boundaries isn't enough. Not even conscious indifference is enough if there isn't an inner structure holding everything else up. Because when hatred is close, when it comes from someone you know, the risk isn't only external harm. The risk is becoming disordered inside. And for that, the Stoics didn't offer tricks. They offered virtues, not as lofty ideas, but as practical anchors so you don't lose yourself. The first is wisdom. Not the wisdom of knowing a lot, but of seeing clearly. Wisdom is understanding what's happening without lying to yourself. Not justifying the unjustifiable, not exaggerating what hurts, not denying what's uncomfortable. In later life, this virtue becomes urgent because there's no time left for chronic confusion. Ask yourself honestly, are you seeing reality as it is or as you wish it were? Naming things correctly is the first layer of armor. The second is justice. And here, many people get confused. Justice isn't revenge. It's not returning blow for blow. It's acting according to your values, even when the other person doesn't. I remember moments when I could have exposed, humiliated, or returned contempt with surgical precision. I didn't. Not out of kindness, but out of coherence. Because I knew that if I crossed that line, the damage wouldn't only be outward. The practical tool here is clear. Don't do anything that would force you to live with yourself in shame. The third virtue is courage. Not the courage of confrontation, but the courage to hold your position without fear of rejection. In later life, the fear of ending up alone weighs more than at any other stage, and that's why many tolerate the intolerable. Courage is accepting that losing certain bonds may be the price of keeping yourself whole. Ask yourself this, even if it's uncomfortable, what are you tolerating today just so you won't be alone tomorrow? The fourth is temperance, the quietest and perhaps the hardest. Temperance is not letting your ego take over when you feel wounded, not talking too much, not closing off completely, not turning every gesture from others into a threat. It's regulating your response so you don't live in constant tension. In everyday life, this virtue is practiced in small things. How much you speak, how much you explain, how much you expect. That's where your stability is decided. I've seen older men embody these 4 virtues without ever naming them. They didn't know philosophy, but they lived ordered lives. They didn't react impulsively, they didn't humiliate themselves, they didn't harden. When someone hated them in silence, they kept walking upright. They didn't win arguments, they won peace. And that peace wasn't soft, it was firm. The hammer phrase here isn't elegant, but it's honest. Without these four virtues, everything else is Stoicism in words. With them, even other people's hatred loses weight and direction. It doesn't disappear, but it stops governing you. This point doesn't end with a sense of closure. It ends with responsibility. Because now you know, and knowing doesn't soothe, it commits you. The question that remains isn't what others will do to you, but what you will do with what you've seen. And at this stage of life, that's no small thing. We've walked a long and necessary path. We saw how close hatred doesn't usually shout, but erodes. How it disguises itself as cordiality, how it needs to diminish you, how it settles when you stumble, how it withdraws support, how it competes without meaning, how it excludes in silence, how it feeds on envy, how it's unsettled by your indifference, and how the real challenge isn't defending yourself, but not hardening. All this not to distrust the world, but to inhabit it with open eyes and a straight back. If I had to leave you with a single reflection, it would be this. At this age, the greatest loss isn't that someone hates you in silence. The greatest loss is deforming yourself to survive that hatred, becoming small, reactive, cynical, or distrustful of everything. Stoic philosophy, when it's lived and not recited, serves a very concrete purpose, so that no one, not even someone close to you, takes away the governance of your inner life. You can start today with something simple. Name what you see. Adjust expectations, withdraw your energy from where there is no virtue, and return to yourself. My name is Gabriel, and this is the Stoic Garden. This channel exists to accompany you in the second half of life, to live with dignity, clarity, and personal sovereignty. If this video helped you put something in order inside, I invite you to subscribe, to share it with someone close who may need it, and to leave in the comments the phrase, "I am Stoic," along with the country you're listening from. I read all the comments, and it matters to me to know from which part of the world this community of people who still want to live with firmness is forming. Next, 2 videos will appear on screen that can help you go deeper. Choose one and continue the path. We're here with calm, with truth, with dignity.